You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop, the podcast helping water leaders to discover solutions and drive change. I'm the host, Travis Loop. This episode is part of a series, Funding to Fight Lead. Replacing the nation's lead service lines in a timely manner is going to require funding beyond government dollars. The municipal bonds that utilities use for a variety of water infrastructure projects are an untapped resource for lead service line replacement. This episode about the use of municipal bonds is particularly of interest to utility leadership, financial staff, and municipal managers. The conversation features Marc Uy, Portfolio Manager for Municipal Impact at AllianceBernstein, Stephen Spitz, leader of the Water and Wastewater Financing Team at Orrick, and Clifford Gerber, tax lawyer at Norton Rose Fulbright. The guests discuss how impact investors are interested in water infrastructure, such as lead service line replacement, the ability for municipalities to finance the work on private property because of the public benefit, and the tax implications, including exemption. Before starting, I want to mention that Waterloop is a nonprofit media outlet that is made possible by supporters. I'm going to take the next couple of minutes to discuss the sponsors of this series, Blue Conduit, 120 Water, and leadcopperrule.com, and then start the conversation. Waterloop. The lead and copper rule doesn't just create compliance challenges for water utilities, it also creates several public information flashpoints that put the reputations of utilities at risk. Leadcopperrule.com can help your utility stay ahead of the lead and copper rule for years to come. Their proven communication plans and products are ready in an instant, and their expert staff can guide your response to any lead information emergency. Be ready to protect the public's trust in your water from day one. Visit leadcopperrule.com today to set up your free initial consultation. Waterloop. Blue Conduit is a water analytics company that has developed a cutting-edge, predictive machine learning approach to locate lead service lines, empowering local officials and their engineering partners with the information to efficiently remove those pipes. The company's solutions enable utilities to focus their resources on digging where the lead is, accelerating the removal of this significant health concern and saving millions of dollars in avoided digs. Since 2016, the Blue Conduit team has worked with more than 100 municipalities and inventoried over 1.8 million service lines, which serve more than 4 million people. Visit blueconduit.com. 120 Water is the only end-to-end solution for implementing the lead and copper rule revisions. They currently work with over 600 water systems, ranging from rural water communities that serve less than 3,000 people to major cities like Denver, Pittsburgh, and Newark. They also manage city and statewide drinking water programs, such as lead in schools and daycares. 120 Water is a digital water platform with cloud-based software, products such as water testing kits, lead validation kits, and remediation kits, and services that water systems and state agencies use to execute water quality programs. Learn more at 120water.com.
You're in the water loop.
Well, Marc, thanks for coming on. Looking forward to talking to you here about municipal bonds and investors. Could you start out by just explaining a little bit when we in the water space hear about the investor community and municipal bonds, what is that space and how does it connect to the water sector?
So I think an important place to start, Travis, is just understanding what's the primary benefit of municipal bonds. And the primary benefit is that the interest that these bonds pay are generally exempt from federal income taxes. And they're also generally exempt from state income taxes as well, if that issuer is from the investor's home state. So in the world of municipal bonds, the investor community is primarily made up of individuals and entities that pay taxes. So roughly 40% of this $4 trillion municipal bond market is held by individual investors directly holding bonds. Now, coming in second are mutual funds that hold around 22% of the market. And also a small but growing sector of the investor community is the impact investing space. And this is actually the space where I operate in over here at AllianceBernstein.
Could you explain that, what that means, impact investor? How do you describe that person? What are they trying to achieve?
Yeah. So as an impact investor, what we aim to do here is to make measurable investments that have an explicit intention to improve the quality of life for marginalized and excluded communities across the country. And as this pertains to municipal bonds, we always feel that this is a natural fit for impact investing, as municipal bonds mainly operate off of what we call a use of proceeds model. So what this means is that if you're a municipal entity, you need to lay out exactly where and how those borrowed dollars are going to be invested and deployed. So this means, are you going to be, using those dollars to build out your town's new sports arena? Or are the dollars going to fix your water system's crumbling infrastructure? Or are you planning on using the bond proceeds to replace all the lead lines in your service area? And these are all the things that need to be communicated to an investor community before a deal closes. So tying that back to impact investing, we need to focus the dollars on the communities that need it the most. And for us as investors, the municipal bond space really allows us to drill in and to be able to make investments in these communities that just have been decimated by decades of underinvestment.
I'm really curious about the interest level in municipal bonds that are going to water infrastructure. There's a massive need in the country to upgrade, expand our water infrastructure. Federal government has just put a historic payment down on water infrastructure. So how is the investment community viewing that type of municipal bond?
Yeah. So, as we've seen over the last few years, we're clearly dealing with just numerous water issues across this country, right? Just over the last couple of months, even though this hasn't been an issue that's been just going on for years, but, issues around the historic drought conditions out west and just, all the numerous other parts of the country where water conditions are just drying up, we're seeing these issues just come up more and more. And also, when we take a look at places like the Colorado River Basin, we see that it's just drying up. And also, at one point last October, the Mississippi River was at one of the lowest water levels in the last 35 years. And even if we take a step back and think about just the surrounding, economy that, the Colorado River or even the Mississippi River helps to support, having these water issues really lead to having a massive impact on just the economic vibrancy of those areas that they serve, right? So in the issue with the Mississippi River, the water levels had dropped so far down that there was a massive impact on transporting crops and other cargo. And additionally, as we see more and more, there just is a huge need in this country to repair or replace all of the crumbling infrastructure that was built decades ago, and really just have far exceeded, their useful life. So for us as investors, we see, and for us, we actually have a huge interest in water infrastructure. This means that when we're talking to a water utility company, we're interested in factors such as, how they're managing their water supply. Are they pursuing low-cost strategies such as water conservation, or are they solely focused on finding and building the infrastructure needed for new sources of water to come in? Right. A lot of the times people tend to think of, solving the water crisis by finding that one silver bullet that can solve every problem with one specific project. But really the answer is an all of the above approach that is really needed, to help, fix a lot of the water issues that we're seeing in this country. Now, some of the other things that we're also interested in is the specific steps and the projects that the issuer has planned to make and the communities that they really want to serve to help them mitigate, adapt, and really be more resilient in the face of climate change. And the other questions that we also ask is, do the issuers have any plans for green stormwater infrastructure? Will they be incentivizing or making investments in bioswales, rain gardens, permeable pavement, or green roofs? So these are just some of the things that we're interested in when it comes to, actual infrastructure needing to be built, right? And really, as it pertains to today's topic of lead service line replacement, we have a huge need in front of us in terms of addressing the public health hazard that is needed by replacing the millions of toxic lead pipes that make up our water infrastructure. So, as we know, more than 44 million people are served by water systems that recently had Health-Based Safe Drinking Water Act violations. And more specifically, these water systems were 40% more likely to serve people of color. So what's been mentioned on your podcast and countless other places is the impact that this or the lead has on communities, as really, no amount of lead in the bloodstream is safe. So my wife, she works with children with special needs on a day in and day out basis. And really she has encountered this, just children with lead poisoning and really just the adverse effect that can have, such as, a lower cognitive and academic performance by that student, health complications. And really, if we just keep going down this rabbit hole, a lowered economic activity that really comes from communities that are impacted by, lead poisoning. So if we're able to eradicate these pipes, Travis, and this can really lead to unquantifiable dollars of benefits to countless families and communities, as then, they will have a better prognosis on life. So yes, our interest level in lead service line replacement is incredibly high.
When it comes to paying for lead service line replacement, again, I mentioned that funding that Congress has put out there. There's $15 billion from the federal government. There's some other sources, but getting all of the lead pipes out of the ground is going to require some other financing. Municipal bonds is something that hasn't been, I think, really tapped into to do this work. If a municipality, a utility, wants to pursue a bond for this purpose, what else should they do on the front end to position themselves, favorably to get that? Yeah.
So, look, as municipalities look to the muni bond market to address, the various infrastructure needs that we've been talking about here, one of the things that I encourage them to do is to lead with the improvements that they're looking to make and really to help investors understand how their projects are impacting the trajectory of their communities. So as we've been talking about, the current estimates for getting every lead line replaced in this country, has us not accomplishing, this massive undertaking in our lifetime or probably our children's lifetime, right? And as a reminder, current estimates number in the millions in terms of the amount of pipes that need to be replaced. However, getting the funding to the water utilities and municipalities looking to do work is pivotal, as it can dramatically speed up the rate of replacement. But, from the success stories that we've seen throughout the country, municipalities really need to go further than simply lining up financing, right? One of the things that we're looking for is, are these municipalities thinking through all the potential roadblocks that they might encounter from, a political perspective, right? So this means, do they have support from the local, county, state, and federal officials to help them remove any potential roadblocks such as owner approval, procurement, or insurance that really might slow down the implementation of the projects. Also, some of the other questions that we're asking is, have they thought through all the labor needs that might slow the project down? By making the investments in replacing all the lead service lines in our communities, this can and has led to the creation of thousands of jobs that can directly impact and improve the local economy. Other questions that we ask are, have municipalities thought through how they're going to bring down the cost of replacement? Or are they able to limit, spread out, or better yet, cover the cost of replacing the portion on private property? This has gone a long way in helping places such as Newark and Denver not only increase the speed of lead service line replacement, but also really remove the cost of replacement as a hurdle in communities that can least afford it. Other questions that we ask are the municipalities utilizing multiple avenues of loans or grants from SRFs, philanthropies, or even the bipartisan infrastructure law to help bring down the overall cost of the project? Other questions that we're asking are, how are the water utilities and municipalities thinking about community involvement, data, and transparency? And really, this is something that that needs to be talked about more. Other people have done it, but I really want to echo their efforts in terms of this area because, being able to clearly communicate the need for lead service line replacement is really key to helping their constituents understanding the public health issue at hand, right? Additionally, community engagement is going to be key to validating that lead levels have decreased once the replacement is completed. And without this buy-in, it really makes it tough to understand if this project is successful or not. Also, from a data perspective and as an impact investor, one of the things that we're always interested in is key performance indicators. mainly because this helps us track the efficacy of our investments and in understanding, all the issues that are going on. So what this means is that I'm interested in knowing how well the replacement of lead service lines are going. We love to see progress, right? That's one of the things that we want to see. And a lot of the times, municipal bond issuers are hesitant to give out more data out of numerous fears of both, legal and non-legal that they might have. They might be afraid about just the criticism that they might receive if a project isn't moving, as fast as possible. But, as an investor, I understand that the project implementation is not always going to move in a straight line, and we are sympathetic to that. But transparency is key, right? Because it's equally important for us to understand how well our investments are doing from a fiduciary perspective, so that I can go off and I can communicate the success of these projects to our client base. Lastly, I would say that municipalities can also position themselves favorably by communicating if equity and environmental justice are factors. As an impact investor, as I mentioned, this is incredibly important to me, right? And as I mentioned earlier, historically marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by lead and do not have access to clean drinking water. Are the municipalities and water utility companies focusing their efforts on these communities? A goal of equity needs to be central in the planning and implementation of these projects. So Travis, from my seat, the municipal bond market can play a huge role in helping communities address, the public health hazard that lead service lines have created. And especially, if municipalities and water utilities can find ways to stack different funding streams together, this can really make a huge difference. And more specifically, the small but growing impact and ESG investing space is always looking to help make these target investments in communities that really need the dollars the most.
Mark, this is a wealth of information, but I think actually very actionable information for utility leaders that have listened to this. I really appreciate you pointing all those angles out, especially what they need to consider as they're putting these projects together and then going to seek financing for it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, Travis, thanks again for having me.
Stephen, thank you for coming on here to talk about this issue. Very grateful for the opportunity to get perspective of someone like yourself. You're a bond lawyer with Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe LLP, based in San Francisco, and a big part of your legal practice is bond finance for municipal water utilities. So, the perfect person to give us some perspective here. Couple questions that seem straightforward, but for the water sector, they might not be, and that's why we want this clarification from you. Can a public entity, like a water utility, like a municipality, pay for or finance improvements to private property?
Making improvements to private property is obviously a big benefit to the private property owner. For public agencies, it's common for them to ask themselves the question, can we use and apply sort of public funds to make improvements that benefit private property? Right. All states have some sort of gift of public funds prohibitions that forbid giving public funds or using public funds for a private benefit. In most states, however, there is no violation of the gift of public funds rule if an expenditure serves a substantial public purpose. So even if there is a private benefit, what courts usually refer to as an incidental private benefit, as long as there's a strong public purpose for the expenditure of the public funds, that is not prohibited by the gift of public funds rules. Here, lead service lines, lead pipes, create a major public health problem. And there's a project create a major public health risk, whether they're located on private property or on public property.
As a bond lawyer, as you're looking at these bonds, what are the kind of the key provisions, I guess, that you're looking for?
Sure. Again, water utilities generally issue revenue bonds, And for most water utilities, this is not their first rodeo. They've been issuing bonds for a variety of capital improvements for a long time, and they have documents pursuant to which those bonds were issued, and they make promises to bondholders about what sort of types of things that they could issue more bonds for. So bond indentures generally have some sort of additional bonds test. And the key for that is that water bond indentures also define the term of water system. What is this system from which the revenues will be used to pay the bonds? And the water system definition is usually limited to assets owned or controlled by the public agency for purposes of providing water, and that would include service lines owned and controlled by the public agency. So in terms of additional bonds, bond documents usually fall into one of two categories. Either they allow additional bonds to be issued to finance improvements to the water system. Again, that's improvements to the assets owned and controlled by the public agency. Or they allow additional bonds to be issued to finance improvements that benefit the water system or further the purposes of the water system. If the additional bonds may be issued to finance improvements that benefit the water system or further its purposes, just like we were talking about gifts to public funds, it should be possible to conclude that the replacement of lead service lines furthers the purpose of the water system to providing safe drinking water, even if those lines are on private property.
Yeah, and it makes sense.
The analysis is fairly straightforward if that's how it's cast. If additional bonds may only be issued to finance improvements to the water system, it's a little more complicated because that may require a conclusion that either through contract or some sort of easement or otherwise that the water system has control over those private property improvements.
I see. I think one of the things that's come up in this podcast series is a doubt or even a belief in the water utility sector that bonds like this can't be used for lead service line replacement on private property. I guess, where do you think that misconception came from?
The idea is that we all tend to sort of think in paradigms and sort of the classic way that things were presented. And traditionally, when we think about assets and things that benefit a water system and the things that make a water system work, you think about water purification plants and dams and reservoirs and giant water pipes and things like that. Your traditional sort of municipally owned and operated infrastructure. But in recent years, there has been a more of a tendency to sort of think about sort of purposes and benefits more broadly. That saving water, for example, through green infrastructure, can be as much a way of benefit in furthering the public purpose as pouring more concrete and building new facilities. So, in this case, I think people have come to realize the purposes are not just to provide drinking water, to provide safe drinking water. And that one of the needs that needs to be addressed is to, getting the lead out, and municipal entities have been to think more broadly about what sort of expenditures make sense in terms of furthering their purposes.
I'm curious, other than what you've told folks today as a bond lawyer, where should people at municipal water utilities, where else can they go to get the confirmation that this type of approach is allowable?
Ultimately, the type of legal advice they'll want to get is from their counsel, from their bond lawyers, to ask their bond lawyers whether this is something that can be done. But as in any conversation with a lawyer, the conversations are better and are appreciated more from the lawyer's side if you sort of done your homework and sort of look at what the questions to ask are. And in that case, I think that the idea would be to approach your lawyer saying, look, we've determined that this is a public benefit and we'd like to do it. So let's take a look at these key provisions. Let's look at what our water system is defined as. Let's look at what sort of things we can issue bonds for, bonds to benefit the system and that furthers our public purposes. Does that work? And maybe we have a situation where we have, our statutes or ordinances allow it to do this, and the problem is that our bond documents are too restrictive. And then maybe is there a way we can issue, say, different bonds, the bonds payable on a sort of subordinate basis, or whether we can amend our bond documents to allow us to sort of achieve our public purposes. So it's always a good idea for clients to sort of, and lawyers don't mind being pushed a little bit on whether something can be done, and if it can't, please, let's explore how we can deal with it.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you so much for your valuable perspective. I appreciate it.
Yep, my pleasure.
Here now with Cliff Gerber of Norton Rose Fulbright. You work a lot on tax law around bonds, including those that municipal water utilities would be utilizing. Want to kind of get the tax side of this issue from you here, because there's implications and questions, especially from the sector. So could you talk about the interest on bonds that finance lead service line replacement on private property? Can those be federally tax exempt?
I think the answer, Travis, is maybe. One of the premises of federal tax law is that the proceeds are used with respect to governmentally owned and used property. That's a starting point. Once you mention the word private, we have to ask the question, what type of private? Is it private business use or something else, like private individual use? So depending on the type of bond, which may affect the answer, as a general rule, if the type of use is for individuals, for example, single family homes, owner-occupied residences, if that's what we're talking about, that will typically not give rise to what we call a private business use, which is what tax law is concerned with. Now, of course, if someone's carrying on a business in his or her home, that might change the answer a little bit, but just sort of stay with the simple case of, home ownership is not going to give rise to a private business use. On the other hand, if the private property is commercial property, then I think you do run into the tax law limitations. And the tax law limitation generally let's say if the overall purpose of the bond issue is water, that no more than 10% of the proceeds of the issue or the property financed by the issue can be used for a private business use.
I was going to ask you what you meant by private business use. So that's kind of the criteria there.
Yeah, private business use. And one of the things to think about is what what's the scope of that term? Clearly, if it were, a factory or a retail business, an auto shop, a supermarket, that'll be private business use. What I think of something that might be a trap for the unwary is, what about apartment buildings? Because again, individuals live there; they're not engaged in a private business use. But you can't lose sight of the fact that there's a landlord there, and there's a trade or business that's being conducted. It may be rental real estate, but there is, a business, rent is being collected. So the use of proceeds with respect to apartment building property would likely be considered a private business use, and then it would be subject to the 10% limitation.
Very, very interesting, because I think across a lot of the communities in America where there's a heavy amount of lead service lines, there's probably a good number of rental properties or even apartment buildings that are owned by a landlord or a business. So that's interesting. That's an important factor for utilities to consider.
Yeah, and tying back to some of the things that Steve, your prior guest, mentioned, is that it doesn't mean that a type of bond can't be issued. It may be that with respect to lead service line replacement on commercial property, that's done with taxable bonds, and the replacement that's done for single-family residences is done with tax-exempt bonds, to keep it simple and put into those two boxes. But if you're within the 10% limit, then you might be able to fold in some commercial property into a larger issue that contains mostly single-family owner-occupied residences.
I see. Okay. And this 10% private business use limit, is that hard and fast? Is there any flexibility there?
Not in the number itself, but what water agencies and municipalities with water departments might think about is folding replacement of lead service lines into larger water bond issues. They're doing a general capital improvement program for their water system, and they want to include some lead line replacement. You could say, well, if that's all part of a water purpose, you could do 10%, but now 10% is going to be based on a much larger denominator, and that much larger denominator will give you some more headroom for including commercial within that 10% limit. It's now a larger limit. But one thing you got to be careful of is, and this may vary municipality to municipality. If it's strictly water, 10% would apply. But if, for example, you've got a general purpose issuer and they're doing, improvements to parks and administrative building and other governmental improvements, things that are clearly governmental, but now they want to fold in lead service replacement line improvement, that 10% limit actually drops to 5%. 5% is the limit on what we call unrelated uses. And you'd say, well, if it's not a water bond and it's really being done for more general improvements, you only now have 5%, but that 5%, of course, may be on a much larger denominator. So I think folks have to just do the math and figure out which limitation applies, and that's where consultation with one's bond counsel is extremely important.
Yeah, great perspective. Well, I think we've been mostly talking about federal tax here, and of course, the states have their tax laws and so forth. What about state tax exemption, which is particularly relevant in some of the higher tax states? How does that sort out?
Yes, it is, and being here in California, it's a particularly important issue since we, I think New York as well, have some of the highest top marginal tax rates in the country. What that does is that that high tax rate increases the value of municipal bonds. And what I can tell you here, at least in California, I can't speak for any other state, is that the California tax exemption is not dependent on any of the rules that I just talked about with respect to federal exemption, the 10% test, the 5% test. and all the permutations thereon. If the bond is issued by a municipal entity, the city of X, the county of X, the XYZ water agency, which is a municipal entity, you will have the California tax exemption, and that may be helpful. So I think what folks ultimately have to do is consult with their lawyers, consult with their financial advisors, and just think through what may be the best mix of taxable versus tax exempt, taking into account both a federal tax exemption and their particular state tax exemption.
Mm. You took my concluding thoughts out of my head there. I was going to say, so talk to your counsel is kind of the bottom line. Lots of good information, lots of good avenues to explore, but pull in the professionals when you're going down this road. So, yeah. Well, Cliff, thank you very much for that information. Very helpful. My pleasure, Travis. Thank you for listening to this episode, and thanks to the sponsors Blue Conduit, 120 Water, and leadcopperrule.com. For all of our content, please visit waterloop.org.
Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.